Hi everyone, this is Dave Thomas once again, and today I am building the Frangible ARCAS scale model rocket kit from Rocketarium. This is another sounding rocket, and it was built specifically to be used over urban areas so that if there was a problem it could be destroyed and break up into little pieces that at least theoretically would not cause a lot of damage. Now let's take a look inside here and check off our instructions. You may have things inside the instructions here like the parachute. Often there may also be decals like we have here. Okay, and we've got a little applicator stick there as well. So as you first go through this, be careful that things don't fall out of your instruction pamphlet here. Okay, now to go through the rest of this, we've got two sub-assemblies here, the ejection baffle kit and the motor mount kit. All right, we have a long body tube here, and then a shorter one, and inside mine is a coupler. Okay, so make sure that if you don't see the coupler, it might be inside a tube. And also inside that shorter tube, we've got a small parts kit that includes standoffs, launch lugs, and shock cord. Okay, and so we've got a medium-sized tube there, and then we've got the shortest tube, and then this little sleeve that will go over one of those body tubes as we put it together. Okay, nose cone, and then a nice set of what look to be plywood fins. Okay, so coming back here, we will make sure we've got all of that stuff here, and it looks like we do. So I'm going to put most of this stuff back away, and when I come back, we'll get started. Now, according to our instructions, our first two tasks are to assemble these two sub-assemblies, the motor mount and the baffle. We're going to start with the motor mount here. Both of these have their own set of instructions included in the package here. These can also be purchased from Rocketarium if you want to use some motor mount kits or baffle kits in your own designs. Sometimes it's just really convenient to have them. Okay, so inside here we've got a spacer tube. Okay, and what we're going to do here is place some glue into one end of this tube and then place the engine block into the opposite end, and this yellow spacer will be used to push that forward. And so this simply pushes down, and then that will push our engine block up into the ring of glue that we put here. So this is all just dry fit to make sure it all works. Okay, so to do this, you can use the little balsa applicator that came with the kit, or you can use something else. I'm going to use this long cotton applicator here and some wood glue. All right, we need to put a ring of glue about 3/4 of an inch down. You don't want to go get this too far down or you'll just end up with glue inside the motor mount. But you also don't want it too far up or you won't get enough glue around the engine block there. All right, so now I'm putting the engine block in the opposite side. Okay, so here you'll be able to see that as I push upward. That puts my ring nicely into the glue there and forms its own little fillet. If you want to quickly, you can just smooth the glue in around that and then very quickly remove this. You don't want to leave this in for very long in case there is some glue down inside there. Okay, now I'm going to let that set for just a few minutes and dry. Okay, so while I'm doing that, we can make a measurement on its outside. So we want 95 millimeters or 9.5 centimeters or 3 3/4 inches. So whichever measurements you prefer. We want to make a little mark there at 9.5 centimeters, and that's where our engine hook is going to go. Okay, I'm going to use a mechanical pencil here to mark this. You can use a regular pencil or a pen, whatever works for you. Okay, and then this is going to go in here, and so if we're in the right spot, this should be hanging over a little more than half a centimeter there. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is take my hobby knife and cut a slit here. If we look from the top, this should be coming in just above our ring. Now if you're experiencing a lot of resistance there, just come up a little bit more. So there you can see the tip of my knife blade. Okay, and then we're just going to pop that end in here, just like that. Okay, and so that reinforces our thrust ring, like that. So here I'm going to make several marks, and I'm just going to use my engine clip here as kind of a guide. Okay, so we want one at 6 millimeters there, and another one at 25 millimeters right there. Okay, and then our other centering ring is just going to go right over the top there, so it doesn't need its own mark. So the first thing I'm going to do is take this gray sleeve ring, and this is going to fit here. So that'll go to that 25 millimeter mark. Okay, so I'm just going to put that on there and then back it off a little bit. And then I'm going to add a ring of glue around that. Now this part really isn't structural, it's not holding anything in except for the engine clip itself. All right, it's not going to be having to handle the force of thrust or the ejection or anything like that. So if you don't get really good fillets and such on this, it's not a big deal. Now I've got some excess glue, so I'll just make fillets out of it anyway. Okay, but I'm not going to bother in filling in what I don't have there. Okay, so there's one of them, and then we have two centering rings here. The one with the bigger notch goes on the aft end, and that notch goes right over the engine clip. Okay, so again, I'm going to back it away from there a little bit. Okay, and then we're going to put a ring of glue here just inside that mark. Spread it around a little bit there. Try not to get it on the metal piece. It's not going to stick really well there, even if it does. Alright, and now we just want to make this perpendicular. And go ahead and smooth in any excess glue once more. Okay, now here, mainly I want to get this straight at this moment. Okay, and then I can come back after this is set up a little bit and put fillets around it for greater strength. My last ring is going to go here, and that small notch is going to go right over the forward end of the engine clip. So here I'm going to back it inward as well. It's a lot of glue. Okay, and then I'm just going to move that forward. And then once more go ahead and make sure everything is reasonably straight. Okay, and I'm going to let this set for a good 20 minutes or so, so that things don't shift on me. And then when I come back, I'll go ahead and put the fillets on, though I may do that off camera. While the motor mount is drying, we can go ahead and move to our next assembly. And this is the ejection baffle. Looks like I need a new blade in that. And just like the motor mount assembly, this comes with its own instructions. And pieces may be inside of other pieces. So we want all those pieces out. Okay, first thing we're going to do is take the screw eye here and put it into the hole in the middle of the forward plate there. What I'm going to do here is just put a little bit of glue right on the hole. And I'm going to thread this on. Oops, come back here. Okay, I'm going to continue threading this in just until the last of the threads are right at the edge there. So I'm going to stop at that point. And then on this side, I'm going to add a little more glue to completely cover the thread showing there. And make a good contact with the baffle plate as well. Okay, we'll let that dry. While that's going on, we'll take one edge of the baffle coupler here, and I'm just going to run a bead of glue around this. Okay, and that's fairly thick and heavy but narrow, and that's what I want for this one. And here I'm just going to place that plate right into the glue. So if you look at it from the inside, we've got lots of glue up in there, and that's what we want, because this thing is going to have to withstand the pressure of the ejection charge. And then I also like to come in here and put some glue along this edge. The plate is not quite flush. It's actually inside about 1 millimeter or 2. And this gives me more room to reinforce it with glue. Okay, so there should be a little bit of a lip of cardboard there. Just run that around. Do make sure you don't get any on the outside. Wipe that off if you do. Okay, and we will let that dry. And I'm going to let both of these dry for about 5 to 10 minutes. So that they will be sturdy enough that we can assemble it without breaking something loose. At this point, my glue has set enough that I'll be able to work with this without having one of the discs come loose. And so now I'm going to put a wider, thinner bead of glue on the opposite side here. I'll just use my finger, rub that around there. Okay, and now what we're going to do is take this, and I'm going to put this in kind of sideways, okay, and then pull it forward again. And just like I did before, I'm going to leave a bit of a lip here, which will allow me to smooth the glue around it into a fillet and give it some more strength. Okay, and now I'm going to let this set up and completely dry, and when we come back we will start in on the body tubes. My glue is completely dried now on both of these assemblies, and you may have this left over on your motor mount assembly. This is a spacer that's used if you're going to use shorter 24 millimeter engines like the C11 or the D12. That simply has to go in first, and then the motor goes in after it. If you're using the 9.5 centimeter motors like the Estes E, then you don't need this. So I would just keep this in your launch box. Okay, next we need to mark the main body tube. So find the largest body tube there. And then in the back of the instructions here is a marking guide. And I'm just going to make sure that there's nothing behind that, and there is not. And so you can just cut this out using a hobby knife or scissors. If you don't want to cut up your instructions, make a photocopy of that and cut it out. Okay, and now I'm just going to get a little piece of masking tape handy here, and then wrap this around. You can do this on either end, but whichever end you choose, that will become the aft end of the rocket. Okay, so line up those two tick marks there. Okay. And then just take a pencil and go through and mark each side of this. Okay, and the launch lug one I'm going to mark with an LL here. And then each of the rest of these are for fins. Okay. And then you can use an angle metal or a door frame or some other marking guide here. I have the Estes one. And here we're just going to go through and lengthen each of these lines. Okay, now for the fin lines, you just need to come up, maybe a third of the way is going to be more than enough. They're not very long fins. And then for the launch lug line, this needs to go all the way up the length of the rocket, or at least the length of this body tube. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and make two other measurements on here just so that I get them out of the way. The first launch lug is going to go right at the base here and extend upward. And then the second launch lug will go up 11 inches from the aft end. So it is going to be up here. Okay. Now I'm going to take some 150 grit sandpaper here, and I'm just going to lightly sand the regions where the fins are going to go, and also where the launch lug will go. Okay. It's about 9 centimeters or so for the fins, and if you need to, you can just take a fin out of the package. All right, and actually I can go up a little bit farther there. This doesn't need to be very deep. In fact, if you erase your lines there, you've probably gone too far. Stop at that point. This is just taking off the glossy sheen, though, that will be on the surface of the body tube, and this will help the glue stick better. Okay. Now let's talk about fins. Alright, so our next step is going to be inserting the motor mount, which we will get to. But before we go to attach the fins, you may want to do some fin treatment here. And so first of all, at the bare minimum, I would go through here and sand these to remove the soot from the laser cutter, and also to knock down some of the grain here. Okay, so at bare minimum do that. And then you'll also want to consider whether you want to airfoil the fins. Okay, and the instructions recommend to round the leading edges at the least. And then you may also want to consider using some form of sanding sealer or wood filler to fill the grain. Now this has got a fairly tight grain compared to balsa wood, and so most likely I'm just going to use a light coat of sanding sealer here, and then the rest of the grain I'll be able to fill in with my primer. Okay, so consider what you're going to do with these first, and you may even want to start working on your fins long before you get to this point. So if you're waiting for glue to dry on the motor mounts or on the airframe, you can be doing the fins at that time, prepping them for when you'll attach them. Alright, so first I'm just going to dry fit my motor mount here. Make sure that everything fits correctly. Okay, it's a little bit tight right in there. Okay, so if you've got a case where it's too tight, simply take a little bit of sandpaper and just go around and quickly drop down the edges just a little bit here. Just do a little bit at a time, and then go back and check to see if that's enough to make it fit. If you do too much, it's really hard to put it back on. I'm going to do the forward one a little bit just to get some of that soot off, even though it did fit. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, there we go. And so when this is glued into place, I want my engine clip to be in line with my launch lug. That'll help keep it out of the way of my igniter clips when I go to launch this thing. And then it will be flush between the outer tube here and the motor mount tube. Okay, so your engine clip will hang down below here, but the two tubes should be flush with each other. Okay, so now I'm going to take my glue, and here normally I use this relatively fast setting glue, Loctite Express. There is also a Tight Bond too that works very much the same. Here I want to give myself just a little bit more working time, so I'm going to use a slower setting glue. So this is Tight Bond 3, it's a wood glue that does this. If you don't have this, just regular old Elmer's glue also gives you a little bit more working time than most of the wood glues do. Okay, and so it's telling me to put a ring of glue at 3.5 inches from the aft end. So I'm going to take an applicator here. All right, measure 3.5 inches there and put my thumbnail on that. Okay, and I'm just going to dip this into my glue. Now I don't want this dripping, but I want a fairly generous amount there. Now I'll place this right up the middle until my thumbnail hits, and I'm going to rotate that all the way around the tube. And that is going to give me a nice ring there. Now I don't think we can see it. Now it's too dark. Okay, but looking down there, we've got a nice, pretty uniform ring. Alright, and then again I'm going to find my launch lug line here and put my engine clip so that it's going to be aligned with that. And I'm just going to let this hang here about halfway out. And now I'm going to put another ring of glue right inside the tube here. And this is what will glue the aft centering ring to the rest of the rocket. So this way we're not trying to just use a whole bunch of glue and hope that enough smears along there. Alright, so there I hit my forward glue. Get this in. There we go. Okay, and again I'm going to realign that. And now I'm just going to take my ruler and use that to make that flush. Okay, and so here you can see just a little film of glue there that's been pushed ahead. I'm going to let this dry for a good 20 minutes or so, and then if you want you can come back and put a fillet in all the way around there. Just be careful that you don't glue your engine clip on. Now the first thing I'm going to do with my fins is stack them all together like this, and I'm going to run each set of collective edges across some 100 grit sandpaper here, just to remove that soot. Okay, and I am just going to round the edges here, and so to do that I'm going to use again some 100 grit sandpaper to start with, and I'm going to use this sanding tee. You can also use a sanding block, or you can just do it freehand, but I'm just going to start by knocking down the edges there on each corner, okay, so that they're no longer square. And now I'm just going to move back and forth and over to each side. Okay, and that's slowly going to give me more roundedness here. And we can look at it in cross section to make sure that we're even. Alright, and just come back and check every so often here. Okay, a little more here. Alright, and then once I've got the general shape, then I'm going to switch to 150 grit here, and I just switch sides on my tee, and this will help smooth that out. Okay, so check the cross section again there. Kind of fine tune it as you need to. Alright, and then the last thing to do is to sand the face on each side. Okay, and that's about the minimum you want to do. Looks like I need a little bit more right there. Okay, so I've got a rounded leading edge, my tip edge and trailing edges and my root edge are all square. Clean that one a little bit there. Okay, and so it's kind of, I would do this as a bare minimum. You can still see some grain there, although depending on the type of primer you use, that may fill in. I'm going to treat this with some sanding sealer as well, and so what I'll do is sand the rest of the fins off camera, and when we come back I will then apply the sanding sealer. I have my fins sanded, and for this next step you're going to want to have a corrugated cardboard edge. Now here I just took a piece of cardboard and mounted an old rocket motor on it to use as a stand, and it works fine for this as well. So I'm just going to put that a little out of the way there. And then I'm going to use a polyurethane sanding sealer. And you can find this in most paint and home stores. And so here I've got my fin. I've also got some straight pins here. And what I'm going to do is put one of these into the root edge. So I've got a handle here. Okay, and I'm going to take a cotton applicator. You can also just use an inexpensive paintbrush for this. And I'm going to just liberally coat my fin. And it's a good idea to have something disposable over your work surface here so you don't ruin that. Paper towels work fine. And what this is doing is the polyurethane gets down into the wood grain and fills it. And so after this hardens and you sand it again, the material on top will be sanded away, leaving only the material down in the grain and the nooks and crannies, and that will give us a smoother finish. And you can repeat this a number of times. I usually give it 2 coats. With this, it's got such a tight grain, I might even get away with just 1 coat on this, especially if you use a filling type primer, which I often do. Okay. Alright, now you don't want this on the root edge, but you'll probably get some on there. And if you do, it's a simple matter to sand it off again. Okay. Your other edges will probably take up a lot of that because you've got open wood grain there. All right. Then once you've got it coated to your liking, you can go ahead and set that pin into the corrugation there. And that will allow it to dry without sticking to other surfaces there. Okay, so I'm going to do that same thing to my other 3 fins off camera. While the sanding sealer on my fins is drying, we can move ahead a little bit here and assemble the launch lugs. So within the small parts package, we have the launch lugs themselves and then these small standoffs. And we're going to glue these onto the launch lugs. And you want to glue the flatter, wider surface here. So I'm just going to take a bead of glue and run that along there, and then immediately put that onto the launch lug. Okay, and make sure that's straight. And here I'm just going to wipe off the excess glue into a fillet. But I want to be careful not to get it onto this surface here, because this is where it's going to go onto the rocket. So if it's not a perfect fillet, don't worry about it. You can add more to it later. And then just do the same thing with the second one. Once again, take any excess and just smooth that into a fillet, but don't worry if it is not perfect at this point. What's more important is that you make sure that the standoff and the launch lug are completely parallel to each other. Okay, and then we'll just let those dry while we continue to wait on our fins. I'm still waiting for the fins to dry. And so we can skip ahead a little bit if we're careful about this and assemble the upper portion of the body tubes. So in the instructions here, they are assembling the rocket from the aft end up. Okay, so what they're doing here is taking the main body tube, which will have the fins on it, and attaching the coupler to that. Alright, so here's our coupler, and here's our main body tube, but we're not ready for the main body tube yet because we're waiting for fins and launch lugs to dry. Okay, so normally they would have us start the next step by assembling this as such, and then completing the assembly by adding the other two body tubes to it. What I'm going to do here, and you don't have to, so if you just want to wait on fins and do this exactly according to the instructions, that's fine. Okay, you're probably less likely to make a mistake that way. But since I want to be doing something while materials are drying, I'm going to do this a little different. So I'm going to go ahead and set aside my main body tube. I've got my coupler here. And the first thing we're going to need to do is mark the halfway point on that. Okay, so if we measure this coupler, it is 5 centimeters long, so we're just going to make a mark here at 2.5 centimeters. That's going to be our halfway point. And then while I've got my ruler out, I'm going to do the same thing on my completed baffle assembly here. And this is also 5 centimeters, so I'll make a mark at 2.5 there. Okay, and now we need the shortest body tube here. So this is the 6-inch body tube. Now, the little sleeve here is actually shorter, but it's not a body tube. We want the 6-inch body tube here. And so the coupler is going to go into one end of this, and the baffle is going to go into the other end like that. Now, I haven't glued anything yet. I'm just dry fitting, but that's what it's going to look like. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead, first of all, and I'm going to put a bead of glue on the aft end of this tube. And this is the one that's going to have the coupler in it. So just run a bead of glue there. Alright, and I'm just going to slide this in using a twisting motion there to get a nice uniform spread of glue. Alright, and then end that at my mark. Okay, I'm going to turn this around and I'm going to do the same thing on the other end. So I'm going to put a good bead of glue all along the inside there. Okay, now be careful as you're manipulating that you don't squish this any further in. Alright, and I'm going to do the same thing here. Now the screw eye should be facing outward. So I'm just going to slide this in, and once again I'm going to kind of ease it in and out a little bit, get that glue spread all over, and then do a final stop at my mark. So we should look like this at this point. And now I'm going to let this dry for 5 to 10 minutes. It doesn't need to be fully dry, just enough that it's not going to move as we continue to work with it. Something else we can do while we're waiting for glue to dry is work on the nose cone. And this nose cone is made in halves and sealed together, so you can see there's a bit of a seam here. This particular one is actually not too bad. You can see the seam, but it's not very deep. Except as you get up here toward the tip, there is a greater seam there. And so you've got a couple of choices here. One is you could just ignore it, okay, and just paint it the way it is. But I would recommend at minimum sanding this with some 220 grit sandpaper, and that'll give just a little bit of roughness to the plastic, making it easier for the spray paint to adhere. And then if you want to go beyond that, you could add some plastic model putty to the valleys here in the seam to help fill those in. Okay, which is what I am going to do. So first I'm just going to sand over the seam to knock down any high points. Okay, and now you can see there, the low spots really stick out. They're still shiny. And I'll do the same thing over here on the opposite seam. Alright, so the same way, this kind of highlights the little valleys in there that we want to fill in. And then I'm just going to lightly go around the entire nose. And this is just to give something for the paint to grab onto better. You don't need to sand really deeply. Just enough that you take the sheen off the plastic. Alright, and then just wipe that down with a damp rag, or I'll use a little alcohol here just because it evaporates faster. That way we're not getting any of the particulate material in the way. Alright, and I'm going to use some plastic contour putty. Mine is Testors. You can get it from several brands. And this is water soluble, it's non-toxic, so you can actually just use a finger to smooth this out without any problems. So I'm just going to run a bead along that seam there and then smooth that in with my finger. And this starts to dry almost immediately, so if it starts getting too crumbly or if it starts grabbing too much, you can actually just dip your finger in a little bit of rubbing alcohol and that will thin it and allow a better spreading. I think I'll have enough there. And so let that dry for about an hour and then we'll come back and sand it again. I am still waiting for glue and sanding sealer to dry, and I've decided I'm going to go ahead and assemble the entire rocket and then just paint the forward section red after masking off the bottom. Okay, so to do this we're going to need to first install the shock cord. Alright, and this is the rubber shock cord that comes with the kit. If you want to, you could substitute Kevlar, and I would use between 100 pound and 200 pound test for this. The difference is that you're going to need to make this a lot longer. So I would measure this against your Kevlar and then make the Kevlar 3 times the length of this. And that'll give you ample room for the rocket to slow down during ejection. Okay, but for the purposes of this kit, I'm going to go ahead and use the shock cord that came with it. So here I'm just going to tie this into a double knot, or 2 half hitches. Okay, and go ahead and pull that from multiple directions so that everything tightens the way it needs to be. Okay, and then once you've got that, cut this part back a little bit so that there's no chance of it getting up in between here. So mine's just short enough to do that, but if you want you can cut this back, but don't cut it more than about half a centimeter or 1/4 of an inch away from the knot so it can't pull through. All right, and then also as an added safety measure, go ahead and add a little drop of white glue or wood glue onto that knot. Alright, that's more than a little. And just work it into the knot there. Okay, and let that dry for a few minutes. And then when we come back, we're going to put the upper part of the rocket together. For this next step, take the 9-inch body tube, this will be the topmost one, and first just feed the shock cord through it. Okay, just like this. Now, normally I would put a bead of glue around this inside area here, and then just slide it together. And you can do that, but you have to be really careful that you don't glue the shock cord to the side of the body tube. And so here instead, I'm going to do 2 things a little bit differently. One is I'm going to use a longer setting glue here. So use either Elmer's white glue or in this case a long bonding wood glue, the Type Bond 3. And I'm going to put this in a bead around the coupler. right along the edge. Okay, now the reason we don't usually do this is it results in the glue getting squished outside of the tube. But in this case I want that. Because now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on like this, and I'm going to rotate the tube as I go down. Okay, and now that glue is going to fill in that seam. Like this. Now it's not doing it completely there. Okay, and so now what I'm going to do, and I can't do this under the camera, but I'm going to stand this up and then let gravity hold those seams together there. If you want, you can even line up the little spiral lines. Okay, and then I'll wipe off the rest of the excess glue there. But hopefully this will give us a smoother transition between those two body tubes. Now the last part of the upper assembly here is this sleeve. This is actually representing the explosive blanket. This is what makes the Frangible ARCAS frangible, so that if this were going to end up coming down over a populated area, they could blow this up and make the rocket come down in smaller pieces. Okay, so for this one we're going to feed the shock cord through the top here. Alright, and then we need to measure 8 inches from the top of the body tube assembly here. So that's going to be right there. Okay, and so this is going to go down to here, and the mark we made will be at the top edge of our sleeve. And so we're going to back this down here. I'm going to run a bead of glue just above where the bottom of the sleeve should be. Alright, and then I'm going to use a turning motion and just gently bring this up all the way to that mark. And then I'm going to go ahead and smooth that in into a little bit of a fillet. Alright, now there's not enough in my joint here to do the whole thing, but that's okay. Okay, I'm going to let this dry, and then the instructions recommend using a filler putty to blend this in. So sometimes they have these sleeves and they're supposed to be very distinct from the body tube, and you can leave this just like this. You can use glue fillets to kind of mesh that into either end, or you could use wood filler or the same plastic model putty that we used on the nose cone. So however you want to do that, let the glue completely dry first, and then if you want, go ahead and use whatever method you want to try and smooth that transition there. Now I have my fins sanded and sealed, and I ended up just using one layer of sanding sealer on here. The grain is really tight, and I think just the primer that I'll use later on should fill that in without any problem. So for this step, go ahead and use some wood glue. You can use white glue if you don't have any. And here I'm just going to apply a thin layer of glue. So that's even thicker than I want it there. Alright, I'm going to take my finger and kind of thin that out. And then I'm going to take my fin here and apply it to the line, and then pull that back off again. And now I'm going to wait 30 to 60 seconds for that to get tacky. Okay, once the glue has become tacky, then go ahead and put the fin back onto the glue. And this should be flush with the end of the rocket there. Okay, so now we want to look at it from the top down, make sure we're straight that way. And then it's a little out of focus, but look at it from the edge. Make sure it's perpendicular. Okay, and now let this set for about 5 to 10 minutes at minimum. If you're using white glue, you'll want to go even longer. And then you can move to each of the next 3 fins, putting them on in turn. And again, do make sure you wait long enough that you don't end up with the fins flopping over halfway through your application. So I am going to go ahead and do the other 3 fins off camera.